Hi there everyone. In this video I'm going to be taking you step by step through tuning this quad. This is the AOS 5 V2 with a Runcam 5 action camera, the Zing 2 2207 motors and the Ethics S3 props. And in this video we're going to be going through how to tune your filters, PID, feedforward, feedforward boost, dynamic damping and dynamic idle. And we're going to do it all in 2 packs using the sliders in Betaflight 4.3. It's a lot to cover, so let's get right into it. Before we start tuning, there are 3 things that we want to check. The first is that the build is mechanically sound. So just have a look over the quad, make sure there's nothing loose that can rattle around, make sure all the screws are tight, make sure you've got grease or thread lock applied to all your screws so they aren't going to back out, and that the build is just really tight and clean. That's the first thing to check. The second thing to check is that you have the correct preset applied for your radio link. So jump into the presets tab, search for your radio link. I'm using DJI S-Bus Fast. Select that and pick the correct option for you. I use HD Freestyle, but you might prefer Race or Cinematic depending on what you're doing. Pick that and save and reboot. The final thing we're going to want to do is enable dynamic idle. So go into the PID tuning tab and find the dynamic idle value here. Now if you're using a very light pitch prop, like an Ethics S3 for example, the right value for you is probably going to be around 100 divided by your prop diameter. So for a 5-inch quad, 100 divided by 5 is 20. Now if you're using a slightly steeper pitched prop, you probably want to go for something like 150 divided by your prop diameter, which obviously for a 5-inch quad would be 30. And if you're using quite a steep pitch prop, or it's a very small quad, you might want to go even higher than that, maybe as much as 200 divided by the prop diameter, which for a 5-inch quad would be 40. Now I'm using very light pitch props, so I'm going to set my dynamic idle to 20. Anywhere between 20 and 40 is quite normal. Having more dynamic idle will give you better prop wash handling, but less inverted hang time. The first thing we're going to do is tune the filters by doing a full throttle ramp gradually over a 3 to 5 second period, and we're going to excite all of the resonant frequencies of the system, of the frame, and we're going to get a really clear picture of where there is problematic noise and how we can fix it. So just one full throttle ramp over 3 to 5 seconds is all you need for this. So once you've extracted the log from your quad's SD card or onboard flash, you can open it in Black Box Explorer, and now we can go and look at the noise profile of the quad and see what filtering we need. So to do that, we're going to click on this gyro scaled roll term here, and that's going to bring up an analyzer window that looks like this, which we can full screen. And then we're going to go into the top left where we're going to select frequency versus throttle. And this is going to show us the noise, the vibrational noise power that's occurring in the quad for every throttle position that you use during the flight. Now you can see that my throttle only goes up to 80%. That's because I have a throttle limit on this quad to help with low throttle resolution. But if you don't have a throttle limit, your ramp will go all the way up to 100%. Now we're really interested in this area here below 200 Hz because that's where it's very challenging to filter out noise, and that's where we want to look to make sure that our quad is mechanically sound. You can turn up the gain on the plot, which will make everything look worse but is just amplifying the signal so that you can see it more easily. So we're going to do that and turn it up. And we can see now that we have a nice sweep of motor noise here and a second harmonic of the motor noise down here, and that we have one noticeable frame resonance on the AOS 5 V2, but that critically it occurs above 200 Hz, so it's really easy to filter out with very, very minimal delay, and that below 200 Hz the frame is incredibly quiet. One way to really effectively reduce these higher frequency frame resonances is by applying mechanical damping grease between the arms and the plates of the frame. So I haven't done this on this quad because it's quite messy, but if you're really looking for ultimate performance, that's how to do it, and that will reduce the strength of this mode significantly. But if we look at it under the default scaling, you can see that there's really not a lot there. It's only when we turn up the gain that you can really start to see it. So when I look at this type of plot, I'm thinking, I'm going to need RPM filtering to take care of this motor band, and I'm going to need one dynamic notch to take care of this single frame resonance. But that other than that, I shouldn't need any gyro filtering, and I should just be able to get away with D-term filtering to counteract the D-term's natural amplification of high frequency noise. We can also check the pitch axis, which looks very similar, and the yaw axis, which on the AOS 5v2 is very quiet, so there's nothing to worry about in yaw at all. And this just confirms that a single dynamic notch and RPM filtering is going to be all that we need in terms of the gyro filtering, and the D-term filtering is just going to be what's needed to counter the D-term's natural tendency to amplify noise at higher frequencies. So let's go ahead and review the filter settings now in Betaflight Configurator. So we go into the PID tuning tab, the filter settings tab, and we can see that I have turned off all the gyro low pass filters because the black box log has shown that I don't need them. I've turned off all the gyro notch filters. I have the RPM filter on with 3 harmonics and a minimum frequency of 100 Hz, which is default. And I have a single dynamic notch, again with the default settings, 500 Q factor, 150 and 600 for the frequencies. And then if I come over to the D-term low pass filter, I have just a single D-term low pass filter, which is a dynamic filter, means it moves with the throttle position, with a minimum cutoff of 80 Hz and a maximum cutoff of 110. And this is a setting that I've found works really, really well for otherwise clean low vibration builds. So if your quad has a relatively clean noise plot below 200 Hz, then you should be able to get away with this very aggressive D-term filter. It's a biquad type filter with a dynamic curve, so it rises in frequency very quickly as you raise the throttle. And the yaw low pass filter I'm going to leave on because the yaw axis is a very slow axis to respond, so there's no penalty for having extra filtering on that axis, and it just reduces the amount of noise that's getting through into the PID loop from the yaw axis. Once you've got your filter set up correctly, the next step is finding your maximum D-gain. To do this, we're going to go back into the PID tuning tab, and we're going to start by setting our stick response gain down to 0, our dynamic damping also down to 0, and then we're going to start to gradually increase our master multiplier, and we're going to be listening out for a couple of things. Firstly, we're going to be listening for ticking and twitching of the motors, particularly at 0 throttle, and we're going to be listening for buzzing of the motors at 0 throttle. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of that now. So there are two things to look out for that tell you that you have too much D-gain. The first is buzzing of the motors on arming when the quad's just sitting on the bench, and the second is buzzing of the motors at 0 throttle. So we can listen out for those two things in this clip. With just the right amount of D-gain, you might hear a little bit of ticking or twitching of the motors on arming, and you might hear a little bit of ticking at 0 throttle, but you won't hear any buzzing. Now you might wonder why I'm looking to find the maximum D-gain using the master multiplier slider rather than the D-gain slider. And there's a really good reason for this. The reason is that the ratio between the P term and the D term, the P term and the I term, and the D term and the feed forward term are all very critical for how the quad flies. And when we change the master multiplier, we move P, I, D and feed forward all together in step, and we keep those ratios the same. And that means that the way the quad flies doesn't change, we just increase all the gains together and find that maximum D term. On this AOS 5v2, I was comfortably able to get to 1.8 on the master slider before I felt that there was just a little bit too much buzzing in the motors for my liking. Obviously your mileage may vary, and if you apply damping grease, you may even be able to go higher than 1.8. Once we've found our maximum D gains, the next step is to find the ideal PD balance. And the way we're going to do this is using PID Toolbox. Test flights for PD balance are just going to focus on snap rolls and snap flips, and they're best done with dynamic damping and feed forward set to 0. So once we have a log with these sharp flips and rolls, we're going to load it into PID Toolbox by selecting it up here. And then once it's opened, we're going to go into the step response tool and we're just going to hit run. And that's going to give us the step response for the 3 axes roll, pitch and yaw. And this is what I found from my testing. So I found that a P&I slider at 1.0 was pretty much perfect. You can see it rises very quickly to the 1.0 line and then doesn't overshoot. And if I increase the P&I slider to 1.3, you see we got a little bit of overshoot on roll and a little bit of overshoot on pitch. And with a P&I slider at 0.7, you can see that there was no overshoot, but it also took longer to reach that 1.0 line. So this is how you can find your ideal P&I balance. The goal is as much P&I slider as you can possibly get without getting any overshoot. Unsurprisingly, because this is a 5-inch freestyle quad, the Betaflight defaults, i.e. 1.0, are pretty much perfect. So as you're finding the ideal position for this tracking slider, your ideal PD balance, you're just going to move it up and down. And for most 5-inch freestyle quads, you should find that it's pretty much at 1.0. If you've got a very big heavy quad, you might find that it's a little lower. And if you have a very responsive quad, maybe a racing quad, you might find that it can even go a little higher. So now we've found that ideal P&I slider position and we've got that perfect PD balance. The next part of the tune is going to be to find the ideal feed forward gains. Now we come to tuning feed forward. And the types of tuning flights that you're going to want to do for feed forward are the same as what you used for finding your P&I slider position. It's lots of snap rolls and snap flips. And when we're looking to tune feed forward, we need a guiding principle to kind of help us on our way. I always found tuning feed forward really difficult until I realized this kind of guiding principle, which I'm going to share with you now. And that's that the P term is the guiding light when it comes to tuning feed forward. Because if the P term is working to push the quad into the move, then you need more feed forward. So here we have no feed forward, and you can see the P term is pushing really hard into the move, and the gyro is lagging behind the set point. So that's really bad. We don't want that. We want the gyro to follow the set point exactly. So if we go to a log where we have more feed forward, we can now see that feed forward is doing quite a lot of pushing and that the gyro is tracking the set point much more closely. But let's look at the P term again, and we can see the P term is still pushing the quad into the move. And at the end of the move, we can see that the P term is also pushing the quad at the end of the move as well. So we don't have quite enough feed forward, because if we had enough feed forward, the P term wouldn't have to do anything at all. And that's the goal. We want to get to the stage where the P term isn't doing anything. So we turn up feed forward again, more feed forward. Now, let's look at the P term, what it's doing now. The P term is no longer pushing the quad into the move. It's actually trying to hold the quad back and slow the quad down into the move. And this means we have too much feed forward. If the P term is pushing against the move, then you have too much feed forward. And if the P term is pushing into the move, you have too little. The ideal amount of feed forward is the amount where the P term does nothing into the move and does nothing coming out of the move, or as close to nothing as you can manage. So we tweak feed forward again. And now we see that the P term is doing very little going into the move and very little coming out of the move. And here, it's not really doing anything. Sometimes it's holding us back a little bit, sometimes it's pushing us forward, but basically the P term is at 0 the whole way through. And this is the ideal amount of feed forward that you should be aiming for. It's the amount where the P term does nothing. I found for this AOS 5v2 that the ideal amount of feed forward was 1.3 on the feed forward gain slider. Okay, that's our feed forward gain sorted. Now I'm going to talk to you about dynamic damping and feed forward boost. Now in general, these tools are not usually needed for small quads, like 5-inch quads. They tend to be needed more for larger rigs. But I'm going to cover the principles now so that you understand them, and also we're going to dial in that tune just a little bit more. If after you've found your ideal feed forward gains, you're seeing an overshoot like this at the start of a move, this is something that can be dealt with by dynamic damping. Now what dynamic damping is going to do is it's going to boost the D term during these fast moves, which is going to push back against feed forward and help stop this overshoot. The way we're going to be using dynamic damping to control this overshoot is by boosting the D term when the quad is moving fast. So we're going to come to the dynamic damping settings here, leave the gain at 37, that's usually fine, and change the advance to 0 because we don't want the dynamic damping based on set point. We only want it based on the rate of rotation of the quad as measured by the gyro, so we set advance to 0. Then you're going to want to increase the dynamic damping slider and do some test flights to see if that overshoot gets better. And I would go up in relatively large steps of maybe 0.25 or 0.5 because you do tend to need quite a lot of dynamic damping to control overshoot at the start of a sharp move. The final setting that I adjust when I'm tuning feed forward is feed forward boost. Now, if I notice that the gyro is lagging behind the set point at the start of the move, but then catches up later on, like what we have here, this is a good example of where you might need to add more feed forward boost. And what that's going to do is it's going to kick feed forward up a little earlier in the move. It will boost feed forward the moment your sticks start to move and help keep the gyro tracking the set point through the start of the move before feed forward takes over later on. Feed forward boost is only available through the Betaflight CLI. So we'll go into the CLI and type get boost. And we get the throttle boost and here the feed forward boost. Now the default is 15. I tend to find that I need a little more than that on most of my quads to get them tracking set point through the start of fast moves really well. So I found the ideal value for this AOS 5v2 was 20. But if you want to change it, you can just type set feed forward boost equal to 25, let's say, and then save. You shouldn't need much more than about 30 for feed forward boost for most quads. And that should get the gyro tracking the set point through the start of fast moves really, really well. You should be aware that feed forward boost also helps control overshoot at the start of fast moves as well. Now, that's not primarily what you should use it for because dynamic damping is a much better approach to controlling that overshoot. But you might notice that if you do increase feed forward boost to help with the start of a fast move, that it does also reduce the overshoot a little bit. Or if you increase feed forward boost, you might then want to slightly reduce dynamic damping because they do sort of act in somewhat the same way. Once we have all these parameters really nicely tuned, we should end up seeing traces that look a little bit like this. We've got our feed forward boost set correctly so that the quad is kicking into the move perfectly. Feed forward is keeping the gyro and set point on top of each other through the start of the move, and P term isn't really doing anything. And we're not getting any overshoot as we reach full stick deflection because dynamic damping has built up to slow the quad down and push back against the feed forward. At the end of the move, we do see the gyro deviate from the set point, but as we can see here, we've got motors going full throttle. So once motors go full throttle, the gyro is always going to start to deviate from the set point. But then feed forward brings it back on top of the set point nicely, and then it follows the set point down really closely. And we have a little bit of P term activity, but not too much. That's really what we want to see. Once you have a tune set up like this, you can be confident that your quad is tracking the set point really precisely. Now that might not guarantee that it's going to have the feel that you want, but you no longer need to adjust the PIDs. Those are set. You can go and change the feel by adjusting your rates, RC smoothing, your throttle limit, your throttle expo, and these are going to give you control over how the movements of your sticks affect the set point, and you can remain confident that whatever the set point is, the quad is going to track it really precisely. I hope you enjoyed this video, and rest assured that you can use this tuning method for quads of any size, from tiny whoops all the way up to 13-inch beast class rigs. The method is the same, just the values on the sliders that you get are going to be slightly different. If you need more detail on any of the things that I've covered in this video, I'll leave a link in the video description to my PID tuning playlist, which covers all of this in a lot of detail and goes a little bit deeper into the theory of how each of these controls work and what they do, how they affect how your quad flies. A big thank you to all my patrons, without whom I wouldn't be able to make videos like this. If you feel like I've earned your support, you can join my Patreon from just a few dollars a month, and that will help ensure that I can keep making videos like this into the future. I'll put a link down in the video description below to where you can check that out. And also, if you'd like to pick up an AOS 5 V2 for yourself, I'll leave a link to that frame down in the video description as well. That's all I have for you for today, so until next time, I wish you all very happy flying.